Hello and welcome to my new series, which I call to myself Lessons of War, in which I describe the things which I have learned during over 3 years of full-scale invasion as an Ukrainian living in Ukraine. And I believe that these lessons might be useful to people all around the world right now with everything that is happening to this world. So if you feel anxious and you feel unsure and you feel uncertain about your life and about everything that is happening right now in the world, maybe this series will be useful for you, and it may give you a change of perception that you need at this time. My first video of this series is going to be about how to work with information, because a strategy in work with information appeared to be very important from the very first days of the war. It was probably the first lesson that I learned, and that's why I have put it as the first video. So at the beginning of the war, it became obvious that information is actually a weapon which has been used against us, against the civilians, to put us into a certain state, to make us feel certain type of way, to make sure that we do not resist and that we surrender to the invaders. And when I come back to the times of the first days of the war in my head, I realized that it was a very, very different place. Like the world as general was a very different place at that time. And so it was a situation in which our perception of the world as we thought it was totally collapsed. And it was this shock and confusion from the crack in the world. It felt like a huge gap appeared in our perception of the world compared to what it actually appeared to be. And at the same time, Russians were launching psychological informational attacks on us. So as I have mentioned, information is a weapon, and it is used very purposefully against people to put people in a certain state in which they are more exposed to manipulation and are more likely to act a certain way. So I've realized very early during the war that I need a certain strategy of how to deal with information that is incoming all the time, and also how to take the best of it, meaning how to build my picture of the world so that it corresponded with what the reality actually is like. And in this video, I'm going to share all of the points which I have adopted so that my cooperation with the information was not harmful, but rather healing for me. So the very first thing that I believe every person needs to establish in their head is why you deal with information, because there are a lot of people who do not have any purpose in interacting with certain headlines, certain events, everything that they read in the media, everything that they hear in the media, and so on and so on. So a lot of people just go from one piece of information to another piece of information to another piece of information without actually making any picture out of it, without actually putting it in place in their picture of the world. So they just go from one impression to another impression, which completely changes their whole system, like their mind, their emotional state, their hormonal state, and so on and so on. And this approach might be not so obviously harmful in a peaceful life, but in the war it is deadly. Like it's totally unsustainable. It kills people. So my first idea was that I need to understand why I cooperate with information. And I realized that I have two main goals. First goal is to be able to understand what is happening in my immediate reality, in my physical reality, and how it may change. So I needed to understand what are the forces which potentially can affect my immediate physical reality, and how to prepare myself for them, how to maintain my own comparative security. And the second goal was just to see what is happening, because it's not gonna sound controversial probably, but what's happening in the world right now is very extremely interesting. It's like the most interesting historic period which is unfolding in front of me. So my second idea, my second purpose was to just observe what is happening, to understand what is happening. So these were two of the reasons why I cooperate with information. And for the first reason, for the first thing, to understand what is happening in my immediate physical reality and how to predict what might be happening in my immediate physical reality, I realized that there is a very important principle, and that principle is to rely on actual physical reality. What I mean by that is that there are a lot of things which are happening in the informational field. There are some leaks, there are some announcements, there are some allegations, there are some analysis, there are some predictions. Some specialists say something all the time, and it is like the informational field in every sphere is flooded with these things. And it is very important to be able to distinguish what is the actual physical reality, what is something that is actually happening, and what is something that is an allegation, what is something that is someone's evaluation, what is something that is someone's prediction, what is something that is just a leak which might have nothing in common with the reality. So the first principle is to actually rely on physical reality. And I will give you an example. So, for example, I live in a city which is like 200 kilometers from the front lines. And let's imagine that I read, it's not an imaginable situation, it actually happened. I read in the newspapers that Russians are planning to go deeper into Ukraine and occupy new territories, including cities like my city. The first thing that happens to people very often, they just get scared because they take it for granted. Like if they say that Russians might occupy my city, then it is the truth that I need to react to it somehow. And people react to it just emotionally. They get scared, they start making decisions which might be not optimal, not the best, and so on. With my approach of relying on physical reality, I do the following. I'm like, okay, the Russians, let's suppose that the Russians are planning to move into the depth of the country more. What I need to evaluate to understand how possible it is. I need to evaluate how much weapons they have. I need to evaluate how much people they have. I need to evaluate what is happening on the front lines right now and how fast they can generally move right now with the weapons and the people that they have. So there are OSINT investigators who have more or less this data. They understand more or less how many people there are on the front lines and not on the front lines. They understand more or less how many weapons there are and so on. So there are like actual physical data which I can evaluate. And after that, my task is to evaluate how this data can change. For example, how the number of weapons can change. For example, Russians can get weapons from China, or they can get more weapons, or they can't get more weapons from Pyongyang, or they can get weapons from somewhere else. We need to evaluate that. And second, we need to evaluate how they can get more people. So I know, for example, that with the current amount of weapons and the current amount of people, they cannot make it to my city. It's impossible. It's physically impossible. But if these numbers change, and I will know about it beforehand, they might actually make it to my city. So I will need to, if any of these variables change, I will need to make a decision of either moving deeper into the country or like moving to another country or something like this. So this is how I choose to operate with the information. I choose to operate with information through physical, actual reality. And it gives me much more clarity and much more grounded. And that's something that I really recommend to you as well. Because the informational field is kind of specific right now. Because on the one hand, there is a lot of this effort to influence people so that they were more unstable, more scared, and therefore easier to manipulate into something. Because well, it's a kind of power when you have the power over people's minds. This is a kind of power which gives either money or political power or something like this. So there is actually a goal of making you scared, making you confused, making you nervous, and not understand what is happening. Another thing is that people generally are more likely to read scary news than not scary news, because for obvious reasons, because we want to be safe, and we feel like if I can see a headline which kind of looks scary, I need to read it, because I need to read an article, because I need to understand what is happening. So there is an incline in media to post something that is rather more scary, more sensational, something that you will click. So these two tendencies, both of them, they create an informational field which is not as close to the actual reality as it could be. So it is our task to clarify it, to distinguish, to order it, to put it into places for ourselves, because this is our only way to stay safe. Or another example, my city can be attacked any second, and even without a red alert, I might not know that my city is going to be attacked right now. And it is scary. It is not a situation in which you would like to live. But on the other hand, what I can do, I can evaluate what particular weapons they have, and what is the probability that they are going to use it on just a residential building like mine in my particular city. So if I evaluate it, and if I look at all of the weapons, I know more or less the weapons that they might use against my city, I can understand that, okay, these weapons are not likely to be used on the residential buildings, and these weapons are not as deadly as they could be. So the probability of dying for me is not very high. That's why I can continue living in my city. But if they get some new weapons or some more weapons, then the situation might change. So it's all the same as I said in the previous example. So what I'm trying to say is that it is our task to clarify the informational field for ourselves, because otherwise we are not very likely to be able to survive and maintain this mental clarity and mental stability. Another principle that I have adopted, and that you might already have understood that I have it from what I have said before, is that information is not to be taken emotionally. Information is to be taken pragmatically. And it was one of the most difficult things for me to do, probably, because I am a very emotional person with a very vulnerable nervous system, and before the war, a lot of things would make me scared and would make me anxious. So at the beginning, when I realized that I'm not handling emotionally all of the informational field, but at the same time I need to be aware of what is happening, because otherwise I don't feel safe at all, I shut down the emotions completely, and that was a mistake. I do not recommend to shut down emotions, because it might feel like it's not something that I can recommend or not recommend, because it's something that happens, then you just are overwhelmed, and it's really hard to regulate. But shutting down emotions has very bad further consequences, because those emotions which are not lived through, they are staying inside of our psychic, they are staying inside of the body, they create anxiety, they create physical pain and maybe even physical illness, they create nightmares and inability to sleep and all of these things. So shutting down emotions was a bad thing for which I paid my price. But what to actually do if there are you cannot imagine through what emotional hell we have been through at the beginning, like in the first half a year of the war, before we acclimatized a little bit. It was literal hell, and Russians were making sure that we were in that hell. They were creating specific events, they were doing specific things to make us feel emotionally bad. And the thing which I feel like might help in such situation is actually just to distinguish emotion and what is actually happening. Because when something happens and I become emotional, I feel like what has happened becomes my totality. For example, when my city was attacked and a lot of people were killed, it was this feeling of rage and helplessness at the same time. And this feeling, it takes all of the system. It becomes complete, it becomes total, and it becomes the same for all of the people in the city. So the whole atmosphere and the whole city becomes like this. And also other people from other cities sympathized with us as well. So it was the totality of this feeling, of this state of helplessness and rage and hate. And in that moment, I was like, okay, I need to somehow distinguish it. I need to somehow realize what has happened, like on the ground, physically. And to separate an emotion from this. To understand that this is my emotion, this is what actually happened, and this is me. And I'm still here. I'm still alive, and I still live my life. I continue living my life. Because if you allow the emotion to become total, it defines your life. And you don't want your life to be defined by fear, rage, and hate. Because it will be a very bad and miserable life. So this is something that I have been trying to do, and I think I succeeded to some extent, is to distinguish actually emotion, actual physical reality, and myself. Like, not dissociate, but rather realize that any emotional state is temporary, and this emotion is not actually me. I am not defined by that. So this is another important principle, that that information is not to be taken emotionally. Information is to be taken pragmatically. But emotions cannot be repressed. It's a difficult thing. I know it sounds difficult, and it is difficult, but it is crucial. Another thing that people are sometimes going is just dissociating from the information whatsoever. So when the person doesn't feel like they can handle all of the information, they do not shut down emotions, but they rather shut down the window to the reality through which they could see what is happening. They just, lock inside of their own world, and they just try to operate in the immediate physical reality, which kind of works for some people, but it's not going to work for most of the people. Mostly because it's like, trying not to notice the elephant in the room. You're like, I can see. If I can see that, it cannot attack me. But your psychics understands that it can. Your psychic still feels this tension, this danger, even if you're not looking at it. But if you look at it, you may figure out what to do with it. But if you don't look at it, then it's just the background anxiety which is just ruining your life. So this is a very bad strategy. Like, avoiding information is a very bad strategy which does not do any good to any person. So this is something that I really don't recommend. Another thing, another way of perception which kind of helped me deal with what is happening was to understand that there are different planes of information, of reality, which information is describing. So there is what I have called immediate reality, right? Something that I interact with physically, like my home, my family, my surrounding, my friends, something that is happening particularly like to me in my real physical life. Then the next plane is, I call it macro plane, which is a place where all the suffering actually is, because it's this informational bubble in which, through which we perceive news about something that is not happening directly to us. So what is happening on the front lines belongs to this plane, to macro plane. What is happening like somewhere in different cities? Some city was attacked, some people were killed, someone died on the front lines. Something is happening in other countries. Someone attacked someone, Trump said something, someone else said something happened, someone cooperates with someone, blah, 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 blah. All of these things, they belong to this macro plane in my perception. And this macro plane is a place which can create endless sequence of suffering, because in this plane something bad is always happening. Something good is probably always also happening, but as we have established before, people are much more drawn to bad things than to good things, because fear is more primal, and people are trying to understand what is happening in the fields where they might be hurt. So this plane, this macro plane, is the plane on which people get stuck very often. Like when we read news, when we scroll, when we see something in TikTok, when we see something in other media, when we see something elsewhere, this is the place where people get stuck and get suffocated by this suffering. Because on this plane, someone is always wrong, someone always said something stupid, someone always did something stupid, something unfair happened to somebody. So this is the plane with which you need to be very careful, and I am trying to be as careful as I can be. And also there is the third plane. The third plane, like the global plane, where you can see like bigger picture of everything that is happening in the world. So what countries there are, what alliances they have, what forces they have, what resources that they have, how money are moving, how power is moving, how resources are moving, how tendencies in politics are moving, how social tendencies are changing. So this is like this very global plane of everything that is happening in the world, which is also very important because it has like these three planes, they are interconnected. So this upper plane influences medium plane influences immediate reality. So you cannot just, throw away any of them. As I have already said, this macro plane, to me, I feel like it's filled with suffering. And it is the truth, but you cannot avoid it because it can influence your immediate reality, your physical reality. That's why you need to be aware of what is happening there. But my point here is that I realized that I need to divide my energy and divide my attention between all of these three planes to understand what is happening globally, so that the things that are happening on this medium plane were in a certain context in which I can actually understand what the things which are happening on the medium plane mean to me and how they can potentially influence my immediate life and what changes I might need to do or might not need to do to protect myself and to protect people around me. And also, I feel like a very important thing, and probably the last thing that I'm going to say in this video, is that we need to understand the general, very global context of the system which has crushed. So basically, before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an illusion of certain security, like international security system or architecture, international law system or architecture. And now it is obvious that all of this is gone. None of this, well, probably none of this actually existed, because law without enforcement does not work, and there is no system of international law enforcement. But anyways, the times of stability, whether it was illusional or not, are gone. And what is happening right now in Ukraine, I don't want to be, a prophet of the bad things or something like this. But what is happening right now in Ukraine might be just the beginning. And there are signs that show that it actually might be just the beginning. And one of the reasons why I am making this series of videos is because I kind of believe that people all around the world might need the experience that we have here in Ukraine. Because the world is not becoming a safer place, and it doesn't look like it will be becoming a safer place anytime soon. But at the same time, there is another tendency, and this tendency is for growing internal core, growing internal strength. There is a saying in Ukrainian: "Хто не жив посеред бурі, той ціни не знає сили." He who didn't live in the storm doesn't know the value of strength. And also I kind of believe that we are all much stronger and we all can handle much more than we think. But there are things which we need to understand and we need to know about the reality and about ourselves. And this is one of the reasons why I'm planning to make this series. And to sum up this video about information, I want to say that you will only be able to deal with information safely and without it damaging your mental and emotional state and health if you have a very, very strong internal core, something to rely on. And this internal core has a lot of different segments, let's say, to it. And I will be uncovering them with all of the videos of this series. But one of the main pillars of this internal core is mental clarity. And it is only achievable if you are able to integrate the information that you are receiving in a healthy and organized and pure way. And for that, you need a strategy of how to work with information. You may use my strategy, you may use my tips, you may use what I have, my experience, what I have said before in this video, or you may come up with your own strategy, but you need to have one, because otherwise you just become the victim. You just become completely vulnerable and helpless, defenseless against anyone who might want to use information as a weapon against you. So this is my point. We all need to go from just emotional reacting and this cloudy, confused perception of what is happening to very organized and very clean perception of information. And this is the point of my first video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was useful for you and look forward for the new videos. See you next time.